In 13,000 BC, under a frozen Paleolithic sky, 3 young people died. One was struck down with a blade. The others were buried in silence. Who were they? Lovers? Rivals? Victims of the world's first crime of passion? Archaeologists uncovered bones, beads, and a mystery that refuses to rest. What they found tells a story not of beasts or battles, but of jealousy, betrayal, and a love that turned deadly. This isn't just prehistory. It's humanity at its rawest. Jealousy, love and murder in 13,000 BC, the oldest crime of passion. Let's start the story. The cold wind sighs across the ancient steppe. A thin layer of snow silvers the high grass, glittering in the pale blue of the moon. Somewhere nearby, the rhythmic breathing of reindeer herds murmurs through the dark. A fire smolders low in a ring of stones, its last embers faintly lighting the edge of a makeshift shelter. And beside it, half covered by time and earth, a body lies face down, limbs askew, weaponless, and still. His skull is fractured. A sharp flint blade once found between his ribs. He died where he fell, nearly 15,000 years ago. We don't know his name. We don't know her name either. But the traces they left, scattered bones, ceremonial ochre, the twist of a femur that shouldn't be there, whisper something hauntingly familiar: desire, betrayal, and blood spilled in the dark. So the question lingers, suspended in the frozen air: did jealousy burn so hot even then? If deep history fascinates you, consider subscribing for more. This story begins at a real place, Donnersdorf, a Paleolithic site nestled above the Rhine River Valley in what is now Germany. Radiocarbon dates anchor at around 13,000 BC, late in the Magdalenian period. The site was once a riverside hunting camp, seasonally used by Ice Age peoples who followed migrating herds and gathered around communal fires. Beneath layers of silt and sediment, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of stone tools, engraved slate, and, most strikingly, human remains in perplexing positions. The most famous of these remains belonged to a male, approximately 25 years old. His body had been covered in red ochre, a symbolic pigment often associated with burial rituals. But unlike typical burials of the time, he had not been carefully interred. His posture was contorted, his chest punctured, and nearby, unburned, lay a hearthstone as if the fire had been hastily abandoned. He was not buried with reverence. He was left. What startled excavators was the detail, the fine craftsmanship of the spear tips, the placement of shell beads around his neck, the presence of other individuals close by. 3 bodies in total. 2 women. 1 man. All young. All stained with the red of iron-rich earth. And so, naturally, the whispers began, not from the dead, but from the living. Could this be evidence of prehistoric jealousy? A fatal rivalry? Was this the earliest crime of passion? Mainstream archaeologists agree on the core facts. Donnersdorf reveals ritualistic behavior, complex social bonds, and possibly even notions of identity and mourning. But beyond the carbon-dated numbers lies speculation, woven from patterns and placements. And one unusual detail: the man's injuries did not match the typical patterns of hunting accidents. The blade entered low and angled upward, suggesting a human assailant, not an animal's charge. Among the more fringe interpretations is the idea that this was not just homicide, but emotional homicide, driven by love, betrayal, or rejection. Some suggest that the 2 women were sisters. Others believe one was pregnant, citing pelvic bone clues and artifact associations. A possible love triangle? Perhaps. Scholars still debate whether symbolic burials always reflect emotional intent, or if we project modern meaning onto ancient acts. But here's the haunting part: even without names, without written words, we feel something here. The silence between these bones is heavy. Not with time, but with motive. As we leave the snow-covered bluff behind and descend into the world they lived in, we start to feel the closeness of their daily lives. Not just the hunt, but the glances, the small gifts, the long winters crowded together in flickering shelters. They lived as humans do. And they died as humans still sometimes do, surrounded by emotion, mystery, and perhaps even rage. The bones tell us very little. But the spaces between them speak volumes. Archaeologists examining the Gonnersdorf site noticed a curious clustering, 3 bodies, positioned close but not in formal alignment. The young man, his bones punctured and unceremoniously dumped, was not alone. Roughly 2 meters from him lay a woman, face tilted toward his final resting place. A third lay just beyond her, partially curled, as if sleep, or death, had taken her in mid-turn. The women's remains were different. One had shell beads near her neck, possibly a necklace. The other had flint blades, but none bore blood. And unlike the man, their bones were not violently broken. They were dusted in ochre too, though more gently, more like traditional burials of the Magdalenian period. The positioning, the grave goods, the pigment, nothing suggested a massacre or predator attack. Instead, it hinted at a quiet ending. Peaceful for 2. Brutal for 1. The question gnaws, were they a trio bound by love and rivalry? Some scholars posit that these 3 were part of a single family unit, perhaps siblings, perhaps mates, or both. In the Upper Paleolithic, social groups were tight-knit. A single band might include 15 to 30 individuals at most, and within that circle, emotional bonds mattered deeply. Mating partnerships were often lifelong, yet not necessarily exclusive. The concept of monogamy, at least as we understand it, was flexible, if it existed at all. Love, if we call it that, was not a private matter. In an environment where survival required collaboration, relationships were a community affair. A partner wasn't just for companionship, they were your hunting ally, your tent mate, your co-parent. A falling out could shake the entire camp. And here's where it gets strange, traces of heated stones, once used for steaming hides or warming shelters, were found not far from the site of the triple burial. But this cluster of warmth, once so close to the cold earth, seemed to have been rapidly abandoned. Tools lay half-finished. Food scraps were left uneaten. As if something happened. Sudden. Unforgivable. One fringe theory suggests the man may have been banished, only to return in the night. Perhaps he confronted a rival. Perhaps he was the rival. A confrontation escalated. But the women remained, perhaps complicit, perhaps innocent, perhaps powerless. Some suggest the young woman with the shell beads had once been his partner. That they had a child. That the other woman, slightly older, was her sister or midwife. Was a union broken by force? Did affection shift? Did one act of betrayal cascade into violence? Mainstream archaeologists hesitate to jump to such conclusions, but even the most cautious admit, scholars still debate whether these 3 individuals died together, or if someone returned to bury the others later. The bones don't lie, but they leave too much unsaid. In one of the site's deeper layers, a small ivory carving was found, a stylized human form, arms raised, hips wide. Some call it a fertility figure, others see a dancer, or a mourner. Could this have belonged to one of the women? Was it an offering, or a memorial? Regardless, the emotional shadow lingers. These were not anonymous people to each other. They shared time, warmth, speech, meals, memory. And then something happened between them that fractured not only a bond, but perhaps an entire small society. Our modern mind wants labels: wife, lover, rival, murder victim. But the Paleolithic had no such clarity. Affection and status intertwined. Survival and intimacy danced hand in hand. And when jealousy bloomed in such a small world, it had nowhere to go, except inward. Or outward. Fast. Final. To understand how love could lead to death in the Upper Paleolithic, we have to think about romance not as we know it, but as a delicate game of alliance, status, and survival. In 13,000 BC, affection was rarely just emotional, it was practical, strategic, sometimes even ceremonial. And nothing said, "I care," more powerfully than a well-shaped spear. At the Gonnersdorf site and others across Ice Age Europe, we find exquisite examples of flint craftsmanship, carefully retouched blades, precisely balanced spear points, engraved shafts. These weren't just tools. They were statements. Gifting one was akin to giving a diamond ring today, except your life might also depend on it. In this context, the hunter who could shape the sharpest point or deliver the cleanest kill held social value far beyond brute strength. Some pieces from Gonnersdorf are especially intriguing. A long, symmetrical spearhead found close to the burial cluster had been polished more than usual, far beyond what practical hunting demanded. It bears no use wear. It may never have been thrown. Perhaps it was made to impress someone, to court favor, or to reclaim it. Among the most fascinating finds was a decorated reindeer antler batten, often interpreted as a symbol of status or leadership. One edge bears crosshatch markings, deliberate and rhythmic, possibly tallying moon cycles or seasons. Or, as some have speculated, the number of successful hunts. Could this have been a courting gift? A proof of worth? And if so, was it refused? Ethnographic parallels suggest that even in mobile forager societies, courtship rituals could be elaborate. Among the Kung people of the Kalahari, one of the closest modern analogues to Paleolithic groups, young men are expected to demonstrate their ability to provide, often with elaborate performances of skill. The Magdalenian culture, known for its artistry and complexity, may have operated similarly. So when we imagine a young man crafting the perfect spear, presenting it by firelight, only to find the woman's gaze drifting to another, perhaps an older, more established hunter, we begin to glimpse the emotional weight behind every flint chip. But this wasn't just about one man's pride. These were small, tight groups. If two men desired the same woman, or if a woman changed her preference, there was no escape from tension. You couldn't move across town. You shared fire, food, and risk. Every emotional crack could echo across the entire group dynamic. A quirky find at Gonnersdorf adds another layer. A small limestone pebble, smoothed on one side, bears faint pigment traces, likely red ochre, but in a dot-like pattern not typically seen on tools. Some believe it was a token, perhaps passed between lovers or used in rituals. Others argue it's nothing more than a painted game piece. But scholars still debate whether symbolic items like this were used for courtship or for ritual separation, tokens of union, or farewell. In the soft flicker of firelight under reindeer hides, these people negotiated affection and jealousy not with poems or rings, but with blades, beads, and gesture. The spear wasn't just a weapon. It was a love letter. And when emotions frayed, it could become something far darker. The man in the burial pit, he may have once given such a gift. Or received one. But when it came time for choices to be made, he was the one left weaponless. The cave walls still whisper. Though Gonnersdorf itself was an open-air site, the people who gathered there left behind evidence of where they sheltered, hollowed-out spaces beneath overhangs, woven hide stretched to block wind, and even impressions of stakes driven into frozen ground. Some nearby sites, like Einhornhole or Altamira, offer more literal walls, drenched in pigment and story. And within these close, smoky spaces, flickering with firelight, real life unfolded, shared meals, whispered plans, arguments, glances held too long, or not long enough. It's easy to forget that love, jealousy, and betrayal are often quiet. Especially in tight quarters. Imagine a long winter's night, cooped up in a cramped shelter of reindeer hide and mammoth bone. The snow outside stacks higher. The fire inside spits and hisses. 20 people, perhaps more, shoulder to shoulder, breathing each other's warmth. In such proximity, nothing stays secret for long. Ethnographic studies of Inuit and Siberian groups show how fragile relationships become when space vanishes. Romantic rivalries, real or imagined, can ignite in the tiniest gesture. A longer than usual laugh. A shared look over dried meat. In the Paleolithic, affection may have been public, but heartbreak? That was a slow simmer beneath the communal skin. Some archaeologists point to engraved plaques from Gonnersdorf, slabs of slate etched with curving human forms. The most iconic shows a woman with flowing lines, arms raised, hips wide, no face. She appears in motion, perhaps dancing, perhaps birthing. Some believe these figures were symbolic representations of female power or status. But a fringe theory argues they might be personal, renderings of real individuals, admired or desired. Could a jealous rival have scratched such a form into stone, or desecrated someone else's? At another nearby site, a carved bone tool bears a set of notches that seem, at first, decorative. But under magnification, they reveal a subtle pattern: 11, pause, 3, pause, 5. Could this be a calendar? Or, as one controversial theory claims, a lover's code? A tally of nights spent, or missed? Scholars still debate whether such marks held emotional weight, or if they were just mnemonic tools for practical matters. But one thing is clear: art and intimacy were deeply intertwined. When your entire world is made of flint, fur, and flame, every object becomes layered with meaning. And every silence becomes suspect. In one reconstructed camp model, two hearths sit just meters apart, each surrounded by distinct clusters of tools, food remnants, and bones. It appears the group had divided into subunits, perhaps family pods. But one hearth showed signs of abrupt abandonment. Half-cooked marrow bones. An unfinished antler carving. Almost as if a fight broke out. Or someone fled. Could this be when the fatal wound was struck? The man whose skull was split had no defensive injuries. No signs of shielding his face or arms. He likely never saw it coming. A blow from behind, perhaps while seated. Perhaps when he thought the argument had cooled. Firelight betrayal. And what of the women? They were laid gently, adorned in beads and red ochre. Their deaths, too, are shrouded in mystery. Did they die that same night? Later? Earlier? The soil layers suggest a narrow time frame, but whether it was minutes or months, we don't know. What we do know is that after the chaos, the site fell quiet. The living left. No more fires. No more carvings. No more gifts of spear or shell. Just 3 bodies. 3 stories. And a silence that still echoes against those cold, stone walls. The death didn't fit the usual story. In most Ice Age injuries, the cause is plain: a broken limb from a fall, puncture wounds from a panicked bison, crushed ribs from a mammoth tusk. But the young man at Gonnersdorf bore something else entirely, something unsettling. His skull showed a blunt force fracture on the left side, followed by a deep, deliberate puncture wound in his chest, as if a flint blade or bone spear had been driven in with intent, not by accident. There were no defensive wounds, no scratches on his forearms or hands, no signs of struggle. He hadn't been in a hunt. He'd been executed. To the trained eye, the wound placement told a story. The chest injury entered at an angle difficult to achieve in combat, low and rising. As if the attacker had struck from below, perhaps kneeling, perhaps from a position of feigned submission or closeness. Maybe even while embracing. Mainstream researchers cautiously interpret this as personal violence, not war or animal conflict. Most Ice Age killings involved groups against prey, or accidental injuries amid chaos. This was focused. Clean. Human. But if it was a murder, what made it worse, what made it chilling, was what was left behind. No tools or weapons were found with the man's body. He was alone in death, stripped not only of his possessions, but his dignity. Yet the two nearby women, though also deceased, had been treated differently, one had beads, the other blades. They were buried, he was discarded. Their final rites, however minimal, suggested care. His, contempt. This asymmetry opened the door to interpretation. Was he the transgressor? Or the victim? One speculative theory suggests that the man may have been part of an internal conflict within the group. Perhaps he defied a clan elder. Or perhaps he violated a sacred custom, something to do with mating rules or intergroup boundaries. In some modern hunter-gatherer societies, such as the Ache of Paraguay, rules around partnership and infidelity are surprisingly complex, and the penalties, severe. Scholars still debate whether Upper Paleolithic bands enforced social rules violently, or relied on exile and shaming instead. But exile would leave no body. Here, we have one. The absence of clear burial practice for the man may indicate that he had been executed by his own, but not honored. That he had done something deemed unforgivable, yet close enough to still be handled ritually. One fringe but persistent theory even posits a kind of trial, informal but consequential, where elders or peers pass judgment. The women, some believe, were central to it. Either as victims of his actions or supporters of it. But that's all speculation, built on the slow reading of soil and bone. The real clues are in the quiet. There's evidence that the camp was suddenly abandoned after the deaths. Hearths go cold. Charred seeds go uncollected. Animal bones, some half-butchered, lie scattered. This wasn't a peaceful departure. It was a flight. And then, years later, someone returned. A second layer of ochre covers the man's grave. Faint, faded, but real. It suggests that someone, maybe a child grown older, maybe a sibling or former partner, came back to lay pigment in mourning. Or in guilt. Perhaps even forgiveness. A small flint tool found near that later layer bears curious markings, repetitive scratches along its edge, far beyond what's needed to sharpen a blade. A nervous hand. A ritual act. A silent witness. He wasn't forgotten. Love, rage, shame, memory, these aren't modern inventions. They are ancient fires we've never stopped tending. And sometimes, even in a world of ice and bone, one spark was all it took. There's no record. No inscription. No confession scratched into rock. But something about the aftermath of the Gonnersdorf death suggests a reckoning, of some kind. Justice, in the Upper Paleolithic, leaves no scrolls or court transcripts. It moves in subtler shadows. And yet, the human drive to punish, to explain, to restore balance after a transgression, it's older than writing. Maybe older than language itself. Anthropologists have long studied how forager societies deal with harm. In many modern hunter-gatherer groups, from the Hadza of Tanzania to the Jew/Hoansi of southern Africa, conflict resolution isn't about judges. It's about community. Whispered arguments. Shared consensus. Rituals that feel more like healing than punishment. But when violence happens, it sometimes returns in kind. So we ask, was there a Paleolithic trial? Did the killer, whoever they were, face consequences? The archaeological site doesn't hand us an answer. But it does offer questions. The man's grave is messy. Hasty. The women's, not much better. But what speaks louder is the camp itself, the moment it fell silent. After the deaths, the site seems to have been abandoned. There are no later layers of sustained human presence. It's as if the place became taboo. Cursed. Unlivable. A community fractured beyond repair. One scholar proposed that the site may have been ritually closed. In other words, made uninhabitable by decision. It's a behavior found across early human history. A violent event occurs, and the ground where it happened becomes marked. Forbidden. The people move on. The hearths are never relit. And there's a deeper detail. Several meters from the burial cluster lies a scatter of shattered tools, microliths, mostly, once part of throwing spears. But they've been deliberately broken. Not used. Not weathered. Just snapped and left. A symbolic act? Some believe so. A form of Paleolithic exorcism, casting away weapons that had failed to protect, or were used for harm. A quirky fringe theory even claims this spot might have been a mourning circle, a place where members of the group destroyed prized objects to signal grief, or sever ties. This ritual behavior has parallels in Mesolithic Europe and even early Neolithic burials, where grave goods are found broken on purpose. The idea being, what was shared in life is rendered inert in death. Still, others resist such interpretations. Scholars still debate whether broken tools signify mourning or mere abandonment, one cautious paper notes. Intent is notoriously difficult to prove in prehistoric contexts. But something changed after those 3 people died. That much is certain. A community that had thrived here for seasons, maybe generations, vanished from the landscape. Their fire rings left to fill with snow. Their shelters gone. And in the silence that followed, the memory of whatever unfolded, jealousy, betrayal, punishment, settled into the soil. No names passed down. No verdicts recorded. Just the eerie suggestion that someone decided enough had been done. Or that justice, such as it was, had already spoken. In one final twist, excavators found a child's tooth, unassociated with any of the adult skeletons. No other child's remains were nearby. No burial. No explanation. Was this the child of one of the women? The silent witness? The last thread of that tragic trio? We may never know. But perhaps that child, if they lived, carried forward the memory. Not as words. Not as stories. But as hesitation. As inherited fear. The quiet kind that makes a people say, we don't camp there anymore. Stone tools don't lie. But they rarely tell the whole truth. As scientists sifted through the layers of soil around the Gonnersdorf site, they uncovered not just the haunting burial cluster, but a constellation of artifacts, tools, ornaments, pigments, bone fragments, that hinted at a rich social world. And thanks to modern methods, even the tiniest details began to offer clues: residue analysis, microscopic wear patterns, ancient DNA. One breakthrough came from the sequencing of mitochondrial DNA taken from the remains. The 2 women, it turned out, shared more than proximity in death, they shared genetic markers. Most likely, they were closely related, perhaps sisters or a mother and daughter. The man, however, was genetically distinct. Not kin. That fact alone speaks volumes. In small Paleolithic bands, kinship wasn't just bloodline, it was survival. If 2 women from the same family unit lay dead beside a man outside their gene pool, one possibility rises: he had entered the group by partnership. A mating bond. Maybe a welcomed one, until it wasn't. But genetics only go so far. The deeper puzzle lies in the wear marks on tools, the positioning of objects, the layering of pigments. And perhaps the most mysterious of all, the symbolic engravings. At Gonnersdorf, over 200 engraved slate plaquettes were found, etched with animals, human forms, and abstract motifs. Some of them were intentionally snapped, others burned or scraped. In one, a pair of human figures appear to touch hands, rare for Paleolithic art. Scholars still debate whether this represents affection, ritual, or simply stylized motion. One slab, recovered near the women's burial, shows a single curved line intersected by a sharp diagonal slash. No face, no limbs, just gesture. Was it a signature? A warning? A depiction of the moment everything changed? Fringe theories abound. Some suggest that these marks were not just symbolic, but mnemonic devices, memory aids used by shamans or storytellers to recall specific events. Could one of these scratched slates be the oldest police report in history? Mainstream archaeologists are more reserved. These engravings are best understood as ritual objects, one notes. Attempts to tie them to specific individuals or events remain speculative. Still, speculation has its place, especially when science alone can't explain why. One particularly unusual artifact from the site adds emotional weight to the mystery. A pierced animal tooth, likely worn as a pendant, was found embedded in hardened soil beside the male skeleton, yet detached from his body. It hadn't been buried with him. It had been placed after. Someone, perhaps long after the violence, came back and offered that small, simple token. A sign of remorse? Mourning? Or perhaps a quiet resistance to how he'd been remembered. And even now, Donnersdorf still speaks. Ongoing analysis of pollen and plant residues in the soil suggests that herbs had been burned at the site, wild thyme and mugwort, both known to have aromatic, even medicinal properties. Was the smoke part of a farewell rite? Or was it simply the last fire of a fleeing camp? Whatever the case, the ground holds memories the people no longer could. And in the cracks between data and imagination, we begin to feel something deeper than fact. We feel motive. Emotion. The ache of something that should have gone differently. The deeper science digs, the more intimate this ancient crime begins to feel. It stops being an abstract puzzle and starts becoming what it likely always was, a deeply human moment, complicated, heartbreaking, and unforgettable. By now, we're not just peering into the past, we're standing on its edge. The snow has long melted. The bones lie boxed in museum archives. The tools are catalogued. The soil samples measured. But still, the air around Gonnersdorf feels thick with a question that won't rest. What did love cost in the late Ice Age? To call it the oldest crime of passion is poetic, yes. But it may also be true. All the pieces are there: affection, rivalry, rejection, violence. And most crucially, memory. The evidence suggests someone cared enough to return. To mark the site. To alter it. To grieve. We often think of ancient people as stoic figures, hard-skinned, practical, shaped by survival. But they were not machines. They loved, they chose, they made mistakes. And when hearts broke, they may have shattered more than feelings. The young man's wounds still ache in the imagination. A blow to the head. A blade to the chest. No defense. No dignity. Just silence. Someone close must have done it. Maybe a rival. Maybe the very person he trusted most. And the women, laid gently, adorned in pigment and beads, were either victims or agents of that same drama. Sisters. Lovers. Silent witnesses. Their bones tell us only that they were honored. He was not. Was that justice? We may never truly know. Scholars still debate whether this cluster of burials was one event or three, whether the ochre was ritual or mere habit, whether the man died for love, or something colder, territory, status, or vengeance. But regardless of the answer, the outcome is unmistakable, something emotional burned hot enough to change everything. Even in 13,000 BC, love was not without its dangers. A Paleolithic camp was more than a shelter, it was a crucible of emotion. Flirtation and fear lived side by side. A gifted spear could mean a new alliance. A withheld glance could doom a partnership. There was no privacy, no escape, no reset button. Only firelight, proximity, and the rising pressure of human feeling. It's tempting to see this ancient moment as distant, alien. But when we strip away the bones and pigment, we're left with a truth that hasn't changed. Someone loved. Someone betrayed. Someone struck. And someone remembered. The engraved slates. The symbolic beads. The broken tools and burned herbs. They may be all that remain, but they hint at a kind of proto-morality, something deeper than instinct. These people felt, and judged, and mourned. Not just what happened, but why it happened. And perhaps, in a way, that makes this the first recorded crime of passion. Not in ink, but in echo. We look back not for gossip, but for understanding. And in the red ochre, in the scattered shells, in the quiet space between three young bodies, we find something uncomfortably familiar. Not the exotic past, but the fragile present, reflected in bone and fire. Conclusion. Somewhere above the Rhine, where the glaciers once pressed cold into the valley, three young people became a mystery that still haunts us. They weren't kings or warriors. They left no monuments. Just pigments, stone, and silence. And yet, their final chapter speaks across millennia, of love that stung, of choices that broke, of consequences that outlived the flames. We call it jealousy. We call it murder. But maybe it was simply human. In tracing their story, we glimpse not a primitive world, but a recognizable one, filled with longing, rivalry, misjudgment, and grief. The oldest crime of passion may not be so different from the ones we know today. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes it unforgettable. So the next time we imagine our ancestors as crude or cold, we might remember, some of them died for love.